What would you do if the people about to become your family spent a year quietly deciding you weren't good enough for them? I sat at that table in a 15-year-old flannel shirt, and I let them believe whatever they wanted. I had my reasons. Before I tell you what happened at that dinner table, hit subscribe and tap that like button, because this story has a turn near the end that I promise you won't see coming, and I don't want you to miss it. My name is Arthur Hayes. I'm 74 years old, and for most of the people who know me now, I'm just the old guy who fixes crab traps on the dock and waters his tomatoes every morning before the sun gets too high. I drive a truck that's older than some of my neighbors' children. I wear the same 3 flannel shirts on rotation. I get my hair cut at the barber shop that still charges $12, and I've never once corrected anyone who assumed I spent my life doing something ordinary. What almost none of them know is that I spent 31 years in the United States Navy, and I retired as a Rear Admiral. I don't say that to impress anyone. I say it because it matters to what happened next, and because for a long time, I made a choice not to mention it at all. My late wife, Diane, used to say something to me every single year around the holidays. She'd be icing a cake or wrapping a gift, and she'd glance over and say, "Walt, if you want to know a person's true character, don't tell them what you have. Watch what they assume about you when they think you have nothing." She wasn't a philosopher. She was a schoolteacher for 38 years. But she understood people better than almost anyone I've ever met. And she was right about nearly everything, including this. Diane passed 4 years ago. Slowly, then all at once, the way these things go. I still put 2 mugs on the counter some mornings before I catch myself. I still turn to tell her something funny I heard on the radio. And the kitchen just sits there quiet, waiting for a voice that isn't coming. Grief doesn't leave. It just learns to sit in the corner and wait its turn. My daughter, Emma, is the reason I got out of bed most mornings after Diane died. She's sharp, funny, stubborn in exactly the way her mother was. And about 2 years ago, she called me from her apartment in Portland, practically breathless. "Dad, I met someone." I smiled before she even said another word, because I know that particular tone in my daughter's voice. A month later, she brought him to my place on the coast. His name was Connor Whitfield, and he showed up holding a bottle of wine that probably cost more than my truck's last oil change. He shook my hand firm, looked me straight in the eye, and asked genuine questions about the boat I was restoring in my garage. I liked him. For a good long while, I really did. Connor came from money. Not new money either. His family had been developing waterfront property up and down the Oregon coast for 3 generations. His father, Marcus Whitfield, ran the family company. His mother, Deborah, sat on more charity boards than I could count on both hands, and every single one of those boards had a gala with a dress code I didn't own clothes for. I remembered a moment from Emma's childhood around that same time, the way you do when a new person forces you to look back and take stock of what you actually taught your kid. She was 9, and every girl on our street had gotten a brand new bicycle that spring, the kind with tassels on the handlebars and a bell that actually worked. Diane and I could have bought her one without thinking twice about the cost. Instead, Diane brought home a rusted old bike from a yard sale 2 streets over, patched the tires herself, and handed it to Emma with a grin like she'd handed her a trophy. Emma was furious for about a week. Then she came home one afternoon glowing, because her best friend hadn't cared one bit what she rode, only that she'd shown up to ride it. Diane knelt down next to her that night and said, "The people worth keeping in your life were never going to judge the bike anyway." I thought about that story more than once while watching Connor's family circle the room at that engagement party, sizing up watches and shoes and the make of everyone's car in the driveway. For the first several months, none of that mattered. Connor treated Emma well. He made her laugh. He showed up when he said he would. But somewhere around the 8 or 9-month mark, I started noticing something shifting in him. The way a tide pulls out so slowly you don't see it happening until the sand is already dry. It started small. A comment here, a look there. We were at a diner once, the kind with vinyl booths and a coffee pot that never stops moving, and the young server dropped a plate. Connor sighed loud enough for the whole row to hear and said, Some people just aren't built for customer service. The young man's ears went red. Emma looked at her plate. I said nothing, because I was still deciding what kind of man Connor really was, and you don't get an honest read on someone from one bad moment. But the moments kept coming. He mentioned once, almost as a joke, that Emma should upgrade her father's truck for his birthday before it embarrassed itself in his parents' driveway. Another time, standing in my garage looking at the half-finished sailboat hull I'd been building by hand for 3 years, he shook his head and said, "You know you could just buy one of these, right? Save yourself the trouble." I told him the trouble was the whole point. He laughed like I'd made a joke. I hadn't. None of these things, on their own, meant much. People say careless things. But Diane used to tell me that character isn't revealed in the big dramatic moments. It's revealed in the small ones, the ones a person doesn't think anyone's grading them on. And by the time the engagement party rolled around, I had a pretty clear sense of what grade Connor's family had already given me, without ever once asking who I was. We're now about 1,500 words into this story, and if you've made it this far, you clearly want to know how it ends. Do me a quick favor before we continue. Drop a comment with one word describing what you think is in that leather folder I mentioned mowing my own lawn with. It'll mean a lot, and it helps this story reach more people who need to hear it. Now, back to that dinner. The engagement party was held at the Whitfield's place on the bluff above the marina, the kind of house that gets photographed for regional magazines. Sailboats lined up below like they'd been arranged for a postcard. Deborah Whitfield greeted guests at the door in a dress that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill for a year, air-kissing cheeks and complimenting jewelry. I wore what I always wear. Gray slacks, a navy blue button-down, my old brown field jacket over the top, because the wind off that bluff cuts right through you in October. My watch was the same one Diane bought me for our 20th anniversary. Plain, steel, scratched from 3 decades of wear, still ticking like it had somewhere to be. Connor greeted me at the door with a handshake and a look that traveled, just briefly, from my shoes to my jacket. "Walter, glad you made it. You know it's a formal thing tonight, right?" I told him I was aware. He smiled the way people smile when they've already decided something about you and are simply being polite around the decision. Emma hugged me tight enough that I nearly lost my balance. "Dad, I'm so glad you're here." I told her I wouldn't have missed it for anything, and I meant it. Inside, the house buzzed with conversation about ski trips and stock portfolios and someone's new yacht that was, apparently, finally finished being refitted. I found a quiet corner near the window and nursed a glass of sparkling water, mostly listening, which is something 31 years in the Navy teaches you to do very well. You learn more with your ears than your mouth, in a wardroom or a ballroom. It doesn't matter which. Marcus Whitfield found me there about 40 minutes in. He was a tall man, silver-haired, the kind of handshake that's a little too firm because he wants you to notice it. "Walter, right? Emma's father." I confirmed it. He nodded, looking me over the same way his son had. "Retired, I understand. What line of work were you in?" "Government work," I said. It wasn't a lie. It also wasn't the whole truth, and I'd gotten quite comfortable living in that particular gap over the years. "Government work," he repeated, like he was tasting the phrase and finding it a little bland. "Well, must be nice, the pension and all. Gives you plenty of time for the boat in the garage, I hear." Connor must have told him about that. "I actually wanted to talk to you about something, since you're here. I'm putting together an investment group for a new marina development down in Newport. Very exclusive, high minimum buy-in, but the returns are extraordinary. I don't suppose that's really in your—" He paused, choosing his words with the delicate cruelty of someone who thinks he's being generous. "Your current bracket. But I wanted to mention it out of respect for family." I thanked him for thinking of me. He clapped my shoulder like he'd just done me a personal favor and drifted off toward a cluster of men in blazers who all seemed to already belong to his exclusive group. Deborah found me 20 minutes later, near the dessert table. She had the kind of smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Walter, I have to ask, And please don't take this the wrong way, but do you have anything a bit more formal for the wedding itself? I only ask because I know Connor mentioned your budget situation, and I'd be absolutely happy to have my tailor put something together for you. My treat, of course. We want you to feel comfortable. I looked down at my jacket. The same one Diane used to tease me about. The one with the small tear on the left cuff that I'd sewn myself, badly, 3 winters ago. That's very kind, I told her, but I think I'll manage. Of course, she said, patting my arm the way you'd reassure a child. Whatever makes you comfortable. A little while later, one of Deborah's friends, a woman dripping in gold bracelets, asked me what I'd done before retiring. I told her I'd worked for the government. She smiled the polite smile people give when they've already decided your answer doesn't require follow-up questions. That must have been steady, at least, she said, in the tone people use when they're trying to find something kind to say about a life they've already written off. Steady, I agreed, and let the conversation drift somewhere else, the way I'd learned to do 100 times over the years. I wasn't offended. I was mostly curious how far the assumptions would stretch before something finally snapped them. Emma caught my eye across the room at one point, mouthing an apology I didn't need. I gave her a small shake of my head. This wasn't about her. It never had been. Whatever her fiancé's family thought of me, my daughter had chosen a man on her own terms, and it wasn't my place to hand her conclusions before she'd had the chance to reach her own. Diane used to remind me of that constantly. Let her build her own compass, Walt. Don't hand her yours just because you're afraid of the ocean she's sailing into. I want you to notice something here, because it matters for where this story goes. Not one person at that party had asked me a single question about my life before that moment. Not what I'd done, not where I'd been, not what 31 years actually meant. They had simply looked at a man in a worn jacket, driving an old truck, and decided the entire story for me. Diane always said that was the most dangerous kind of arrogance, not the loud kind, but the quiet kind that never even bothers to ask. The turning point of the whole evening happened almost by accident, the way the truest things usually do. I'd stepped out onto the back deck for some air, away from the noise, looking out at the marina lights reflecting off the water. A young man in a server's uniform came out to collect empty glasses from a side table, and he stopped cold when he saw me. He set the tray down slowly, like his hands had suddenly forgotten how to hold things. "Sir," he said, "Admiral Grady?" I turned. It took me a second, and then it hit me. Petty Officer Reyes. He'd served under my command on the destroyer squadron out of San Diego. Must have been 12, 13 years ago now. He was younger then, greener, but I recognized the eyes. "Reyes," I said, "I'll be damned." He came to attention right there on that deck, tray forgotten, and gave me a salute so crisp it looked like it belonged on a parade ground, not a catering job. "It's an honor, sir. I didn't expect. What are you doing here?" Conversations near the sliding door had gone quiet. I hadn't noticed the small crowd that had gathered until I looked past Reyes and saw Connor standing there, along with his mother, his father, and my daughter, all staring out onto that deck like they'd walked into the wrong house. "My daughter's getting married," I told Reyes, and I nodded him back to ease. "Good to see you doing well, son." "Yes, sir. Working 2 jobs to finish my degree. But, sir, if I can just say, serving under you was the best 2 years of my career. You remember when the fire broke out in the engine room off Guam?" He turned to the small crowd behind him without waiting for permission, the excitement of running into an old commanding officer clearly overriding any read of the room. This man walked straight into black smoke without his mask on right because a kid had gotten trapped in there, and he pulled him out himself. 240 sailors on that ship, and every single one of us would have followed him into anything. Nobody said a word. Deborah's wine glass hung motionless in her hand. Marcus had gone very still, the way people do when they realize they've been standing on ground that just shifted underneath them. Connor's mouth opened slightly, and nothing came out. Emma stepped forward first. "Dad." What is he talking about? Admiral, I looked at my daughter, and for a moment I thought about all the years I'd let this exact conversation wait. Diane's voice was in my head, the same as it always was in moments like this. Let them believe you have nothing, and watch what they do with that belief. It had never been about hiding the truth from Emma out of secrecy. It had been about giving her the chance to build her own opinion of me, one not weighted down by rank or ribbons. I served 31 years in the Navy, I said quietly. I retired as a Rear Admiral 6 years ago. The silence that followed was different from the silence before. That first silence had been the sound of assumptions settling comfortably into place. This one was the sound of every single one of those assumptions collapsing at once. We're closing in on 3,000 words now. And if this story has already surprised you once, stick around, because it's about to surprise you twice more before we're through. If you're enjoying it so far, do something different this time. Share it with one person in your life who's ever been underestimated for the wrong reasons. They'll know exactly why you sent it. Marcus was the first to find his voice. Rear Admiral. He repeated slowly, like the rank required translating. You're telling me you were a flag officer in the United States Navy. That's right. And this whole time, you let me talk to you about. He stopped himself, visibly replaying the conversation about the investment group in his head, hearing his own words about my bracket echo back at him with an entirely new and uncomfortable meaning. Deborah set her wine glass down very carefully on the railing. Walter, I offered you a tailor. You did, I said. That was kind of you. I told you I'd pay for a suit. Her voice had gone thin. You did that too. Connor still hadn't spoken. He stood there staring at me the way you'd stare at a familiar street after a storm has rearranged everything on it. Finally, quietly, he said, You have a boat in your garage you're building by hand. You drive a truck older than I am. You let me tell you to your face that you should let Emma buy you a decent watch. He looked down at my wrist, at the same scratched steel watch Diane had given me decades earlier. That watch probably means more than every single thing my family owns. And I stood there and insulted it. You didn't know? I said. That's exactly the problem, he said, and there was real pain in it now, not performance. I never asked. Not once. I looked at what you had and decided who you were, and I never once wondered if I had it backwards. Reyes, realizing he'd wandered into something far larger than a joyful reunion, quietly excused himself and picked his tray back up, though not before I saw him fighting back a small, proud smile. Some habits from the Navy never leave a man. Loyalty is one of them, and clearly Reyes still had plenty to spare. The party more or less dissolved into a strange, subdued quiet after that. Small conversations returned, but the air had changed. Marcus pulled me aside near the edge of the deck about 20 minutes later, his earlier bravado entirely gone. I owe you an apology, he said. I looked at a man in a worn jacket and assumed I understood his whole life in about 4 seconds. That's not the kind of man I want to be, and it's certainly not the kind of man I want my son to become. I've watched him change these last couple of years, Walter, and if I'm honest, tonight scared me, because I think I've been the one teaching him to measure people the wrong way. I told him that recognizing it was the hardest part, and that everything after that was just practice. He nodded slowly, and for the first time all evening, he looked less like a man protecting an empire and more like a father worried about his son. Can I ask you something? He said, before I turned to go back inside. That investment group I mentioned earlier. Would you have said yes if I'd asked you the right way? I thought about it honestly before answering. Probably not, I told him. Not because of the money. Because you asked me to invest in something before you'd asked me a single question about who I was. That's not really an investment pitch, Marcus. That's a guest dressed up as an opportunity. He absorbed that quietly, the way a man does when he's just been handed a piece of advice he knows he'll be turning over in his head for a long while. 2 weeks later, he called to apologize again, this time more specifically, and asked if I'd be willing to meet with him properly. No pitch involved, Just two fathers getting to know each other before their children got married. I said yes. That first coffee turned into a standing Thursday morning ritual that lasted the rest of that year. And somewhere in those Thursday mornings, Marcus stopped talking about me the way he talked about deals and started talking to me the way you talk to family. Emma found me by the water a while later, arms wrapped around herself against the cold. You could have told me, she said. Not angry, just tired. The way grief and shock and relief all tend to make a person tired at the same time. I could have, I agreed. But I wanted you to fall in love with the life we built, not the rank I carried. Your mother taught me that. She always said a title tells you what a man did. It never tells you who he is. Emma leaned her head against my shoulder, the way she used to when she was small enough for me to carry her up to bed. I think I understand, she said. I just wish I hadn't found out the same night his mother offered to buy you a suit. I laughed, actually laughed, for the first time all evening. So do I, sweetheart. So do I. The weeks after the party unfolded slower than I expected, and in some ways more meaningfully than the party itself. Connor called me 2 days later and asked if he could come by alone. I told him to come whenever he liked. He showed up that Saturday morning in jeans and an old sweatshirt, nothing like the polished version of himself I'd grown used to seeing. We sat in my garage next to the half-finished sailboat hull, and for a long while neither of us said much. Finally, he ran his hand along the curve of the wood and asked, "How long does something like this take?" "About 4 years, if I'm patient," I said. "Longer, if I'm not." "Why not just buy one? You clearly could have, this whole time." I thought about how to answer that honestly. Because the boat was never really the point, Connor. The building is the point. You learn things about patience and precision and what actually matters when you're forced to do something slow, with your own 2 hands, instead of writing a check and being done with it. My whole career, I commanded ships I never built a single plank of. This is the one thing in my life I got to build from nothing, board by board, and I wasn't going to skip that just because I could afford to. He sat with that for a long moment. "I think I've spent years writing checks instead of building anything," he finally said. "I've been so focused on protecting what my family already has that I never stopped to ask what kind of man I actually wanted to become while protecting it." I told him that noticing it was already more than most people manage. He asked, quietly, if I'd take him along sometime to see the Veterans Outreach Group I still volunteered with down at the Naval Support Center 2 towns over. I told him I'd be glad to. Before he left that morning, he stopped by the workbench and picked up an old photograph I kept pinned to the wall above my tools. Diane and me, decades younger, standing in front of the first house we ever owned, a place barely big enough to turn around in, paint peeling off the porch rail. "You look happy," he said. We were, I told him, happier than we were later, if I'm honest, once we actually had money to spare. He asked how that was possible. I told him it was because back then, neither of us had the luxury of measuring each other by anything except how we showed up when things were hard. Money has a way of letting people stop asking that question of each other, if they're not careful. He stood there a long moment looking at that photograph, and I could see something behind his eyes shifting, quietly, the way tide does before you notice the shoreline has changed. He came the following Tuesday, and he came every Tuesday after that for the rest of the year. At first, he mostly just listened, to men who'd spent birthdays overseas, to women who'd buried friends far too young, to a young corpsman who still couldn't talk about the things he'd seen without his hands shaking. Connor didn't have much to say in those early visits, but he showed up, and eventually showing up became its own kind of language. Around the 6-month mark, he started something on his own, a scholarship fund, quietly, using none of his family's marketing team or press connections, for children of service members who wanted to attend the same trade schools his own family's construction business partnered with. He didn't tell Emma about it until it was already fully funded. When she found out, she cried harder than she had the night on the deck. We're past 4,500 words now, which means we're almost at the end of this story, and I promise you the ending is worth the wait. If this story has moved you even a little, Go ahead and subscribe right now before you forget, because I share stories exactly like this one every single week, about the quiet moments where character finally gets tested and revealed. The wedding took place the following spring, not at the country club Deborah had originally booked, but at a small chapel near the marina, the same one where Diane and I had renewed our vows on our 30th anniversary years earlier. Emma had insisted on it the moment she saw it, and I don't think it was an accident that it looked out over the same water where Reyes had once stood at attention on a stranger's back deck. I wore my old brown jacket to the rehearsal dinner, mostly out of habit, and nobody in that family so much as blinked. Deborah had, by then, stopped offering to buy me things and started asking me questions instead, about the Navy, about Diane, about the boat that was, by the wedding, finally seaworthy enough for its first trip out past the breakwater. Marcus shook my hand at the reception, and this time it wasn't the too firm handshake of a man trying to prove something. It was just a handshake, plain and honest, between two fathers. Connor found me near the edge of the reception, away from the music, the same way I'd found that quiet corner at his parents' party all those months before. "I respected you the night I found out your rank," he said. "But I think I only started to actually understand you the first Tuesday I sat quietly in that room and listened to a man tell me about the friend he lost in the Gulf. That's when it stopped being about who you used to command and started being about who you actually are." I told him that was the only promotion that had ever really mattered to me. He didn't fully understand it that night, not the way I meant it, but I could see in his face that he was getting closer, one Tuesday at a time. People sometimes ask me now whether that night on the deck changed the Whitfield family. I've thought about that question a lot, and I don't think that's quite the right way to look at it. That night didn't change anyone. It simply pulled back a curtain that had been hanging there the whole time, and let everyone finally see what had been standing behind it all along. A young man capable of humility he hadn't yet practiced, a father capable of admitting he'd been teaching the wrong lessons, a mother capable of genuine warmth once pity stopped getting in the way, and a daughter brave enough to marry into a family mid-transformation and trust that the transformation was real. As for me, I still wear the same jacket. I still drive the same truck. The boat sits finished in my garage now, and some mornings I take it out past the breakworker just to feel the wind the way I used to feel it on the deck of a destroyer 40 years ago. Except now there's no crew waiting on my orders, just quiet water and my own thoughts, and, most days, the sound of Diane's voice reminding me that she was right about nearly everything. Rank fades. Money changes hands. Houses get sold and titles get passed down, and eventually every single thing we spend our lives building gets handed off to someone else. What doesn't fade, what actually survives all of it, is the way you treated the people who couldn't do anything for you. That's the only inheritance that was ever really worth protecting, and it's the only one no attorney can draft an agreement around. If this story reminded you of someone in your own life, a parent you underestimated, a person you judged too quickly, a quiet man in an old jacket who turned out to be carrying more than you ever guessed, do something about it before pride has the chance to build a wall love has to tear back down later. And if you want more stories like this one, stories about the quiet strength hiding behind ordinary lives, make sure you're subscribed, because there's another one waiting for you next week.